Hello, everyone. This is Ben Dunn, your AP Sensei, your comic book guru, and just overall nice guy, I think. I am the founder of Antarctic Press and creator of such comics as Ninja High School, Warrior Nun, and a host of other books. Today is January 23rd, 2026, and I'm here to talk about the comic industry, comic books in general, the creative side as well as the business side of comics. You know, um, People have asked me why I don't just, I used to cover things like pop culture and give my opinion on the latest outrage in popular culture these days. And I was thinking about talking about things like the He-Man trailer and the Starfleet Academy, and I just don't see any point in that, to be honest. There's plenty of people who give their opinions. You're more than welcome to listen to what they have to say, but in the end, they're just opinions. You can like or dislike something. It's a free country, so far, and you can say whatever you want about something with no consequence. And which brings me up to today's topic is why do people criticize other people's work of art or what they're doing? It always seems kind of strange to me that creative types seem to have strong opinions of other creative types. It seems pointless to do that other than just wanting to make trouble, create conflict, and for the most part, they probably don't even know the other guy or creative type, but they don't like what they say, they don't like what they do, so they have to somehow interject their opinion on things for whatever reason. And I'm here to tell you that that's not very productive. It actually is counterproductive. There's a lot of back and forth going on in the comic industry between creative types, and I find very detrimental to the overall health of the comic book industry. What's the meaning and purpose, of trying to create trouble for other people, other than just wanting to create trouble? Who cares how successful a publisher is or a creative type is, how much money they make? It what business is it of yours? Unless you feel like they're a threat. If they're a threat to you, yeah, I could see how, you'd want to lash to try to neutralize that threat. But for God's sakes, people, this is comic books. Comic books is in the business about entertaining people, about creating worlds and giving some sort of escapism. And I I don't see how it helps anybody when other creators somehow take it upon themselves to try to elevate themselves above another creator, by attacking their work, by attacking their success or lack thereof. You know, I will be honest with you. I'm not a rich man. Okay. I wish I was. Don't get me wrong. I want to be successful because I know that monetary success translates into being able to do more. My philosophy has always been that any money I make is reinvested back into some future project, to help others, to give people a chance to be discovered. I'm not here to accumulate wealth just for the sake of accumulating wealth, just so I can brag about it, and show off, my accumulated wealth. It's it's not a good look. People can look at that and decide for them. I mean, it's nothing wrong with being successful, but if you want my advice, be humble about it. Don't show it off. Don't, feel like you have to brag about it just so you can own some competitor or perceived enemy. It just, or just to let, to somehow give the illusion of success. In Asian cultures, there's a sort of a psychological thing that they do where they have to project success even though they have no success. They feel like the illusion of success is enough to convince people that they are successful. And that is what it is an illusion. My father used to tell me there's only one thing in life you should be focused on, and that's for you to be happy. Are you happy? Are you happy what you're doing? Does bringing other people down make you happy? Does bragging about your financial success make you happy? Yeah, maybe for some. I don't know. I don't, I can't read minds, but you yourself should know. You should ask yourself internally, what I'm doing, does it make me happy? Why am I doing this? So many people in this industry complain about every little thing, and I ask myself, then why in the world are you in this business? People who work, there's a difference between having a career and doing work. Working at McDonald's, working, for somebody, that's work. Yeah, you expect to be paid for work, and that's the extent of it. If you're happy with your work, fantastic. That is a plus. For most people, what they want to be happy with what they're doing. And being able to create comics, at least for myself, being able to create comics makes me extremely happy. What makes me even more so is that people who read my books are happy with too as well. I have one job only, is to create comics and entertain people. That's my only job. If I'm doing my job well, people will support me. People will say exchange, monetary, they'll exchange money, for me to continue to create. And that itself is reward enough. Now, all I'm saying is that, if you are a comic book publisher or a comic book creator, just focus on yourself. Focus on what you're doing. Focus on your fans and readers. Focus on expanding your reach with the material you create. Don't waste your time attacking other creators. Don't waste your time, belittling your fans and readers, insulting half your audience, with your political beliefs. People honestly don't care about that. Oh yeah, they'll click on it, but they're not going to buy your stuff. The people who buy your stuff generally want, you to create. And it just seems odd to me that, in this industry, we have a situation where everyone seems to want to be able to express their political beliefs, their personal beliefs. I, most people don't care. Okay, they don't care. They'll read it, because it's clickbaity or whatever you want to call it these days. Or to get views. I'm not interested in getting views. I'm interested in changing people's minds. I'm interested in wanting to become connective and making the comic industry healthy and strong. And the only way to do that is to create product and to respect our readers. That's the only way that it can be accomplished. When you're not producing good material for people to read and you're attacking the very same readers, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're pouring gasoline on a fire, that didn't need to be lit. It just doesn't make any sense. So I just want to say, that to, the readers that, you should not, support creators who you don't believe in. You only, your money is too valuable to waste on something that you do not enjoy. What's the point of that? I have to work hard every day to make sure that everything I produce is something that people want to read. People want to be entertained, escape from their mundane world, into a world where anything is possible. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, be happy. Life's too short for you to be miserable and depressed and angry all the time. Because they do not sustain long term, self satisfaction, self fulfillment. Because what are we put on this world, to, I honestly believe you can do whatever you want, but harm nobody. Just harm nobody. Do whatever you want, harm nobody. That's just the basic tenet I think we should follow. Well, anyway, I'm going to try to continue to do what I can to make this industry as healthy and strong as possible. And if my little spiel makes any difference, then great. If not, I hope I've entertained you for at least a couple of minutes. So here's the caveat in all this is that I do have a Kickstarter campaign, Fur Force. The link will be below if you want to check it out. It's a new graphic novel that I created that features a bunch of furry superheroes: Tomorrow Fox, Atomic Mouse, and Hoppy, and a host of others in the vein of the Captain Carrot and the Zoo Crew. I hope you'll check it out. Until next time, this has been Dunn signing off.